what's the objective? And if you don't just start a conflict and see what happens. You've got to have a clear objective and a reasonable chance of getting to where your objective is. And I just don't know what that is. And the Americans haven't articulated it either.
Developments around Iran have been hard to unpack. Since the 12-day war and US targeted bombings on Iranian nuclear facilities in June last year, there has been an uneasy escalation towards a potential conflict between Israel, the US, and Iran. Friend of the pod, Dr Scott Burchill, IR professor from Deakin University, joins us to help unpack some of the developments. Scott and I will look at some of the events that led up to recent violent protests in Iran. We will also explore some of the developments on the ground, both with the build-up of military material and troops in the region, as well as some signals coming out of the Trump White House and the regime in Tehran. Dr. Burchill is one of the sharpest voices you'll hear on Iran in this country. And over the last months and years, Scott's provided some of the best analysis you'll find. So with no further ado, please join us for an interesting episode with Dr. Scott Burchill. Thank you very much for joining us today, Scott Burchill.
You're welcome, Joel.
It's great to have you back for our first episode for the year. And being a friend of the pod, I couldn't think of anyone better than Mr. Burchill to come on and speak about Iran and the developments that we've been going through over the last 12 months or so.
Yes, look, it all began, well, it didn't begin, but perhaps the historical basis of this is to understand that Iran represents in the Middle East the greatest barrier to the domination of the United States and Israel. And it's a country which doesn't take orders from them and has sufficient military power to respond to any attacks that are meted out against it. That doesn't mean that they would always prevail in a military conflict, although in the Persian Gulf, the United States has war gamed there with Iran for years and never been able to successfully do so. But Iran's a very important country of over 90 million people, and it just doesn't take orders from the West. It doesn't adhere to what Western values translates into, which is you do as we tell you, or there'll be punishment. And the nuclear issue was really symbolic of that. It wasn't so much that Iran was getting very close to a nuclear weapon in June last year. It was just that Israel was on a regional rampage effectively, and Iran represented the greatest capacity for the assistance that they could give to Palestinian groups, southern Lebanon, the Houthi, and so on. So Iran, there was a limited military striker and a conflict that went on for 12 days. Which resulted in, I presume, some significant damage to some of Iran's nuclear resources, but apparently not significant in terms of their fissile material. And they also, of course, responded with hypersonic missiles targeted at Israel, which caused significant damage to airports and other infrastructure. So that's where we were until Trump decided to intervene, and with a very limited campaign. And I think the significance of that bombing campaign that he launched was to acknowledge how difficult it is in the case of Iran to go further, either with regime change, a decapitation, as we saw in Venezuela recently, but also a full-scale boots-on-the-ground style invasion of the country. So that's how we get to where we are closer today, which is a recognition that the United States has no appetite for boots on the ground in Iran. If they're not prepared to put them into Venezuela, it's best to try and change the regime somehow with risk-free military activities, relatively risk-free from their point of view, and then incite insurrection amongst the population who have had to live under a very repressive government for 40 years, as well as the effects of economic sanctions, which have effectively triggered this last and most recent um, incitement within the country. Shopkeepers, I think, sort of led the path in that respect. And these sanctions have been crippling the Iranian economy for years. And they were supposed to, of course, go in exchange for the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement that was struck by the Obama administration, which Trump subsequently cancelled, but promised to actually negotiate a better one, which never came to anything. From Israel's point of view, of course, they just want the elimination of the clerical regime there. So we saw a combination of two things. We saw the insurrection, an endogenous insurrection where people periodically have been doing in Iran, protesting against prices of goods and restrictions on civil liberties. That's been going on periodically for decades. Nothing really new there, but this one was pretty intense. Coupled with,
And on that, Scott, I just wanted to ask that question. Did these protests that originated in December 2025, were they influenced by that post-nuclear strike period? Was there some kind of domestic unrest that was influencing this? Were they only sparked by economic grievances, or was there something due to the aftermath of that 12-day war that has, influenced these protests?
I'm not sure. Look, it's very difficult to know. I guess there's elements of all of that would have played in. I think the economic factors bit hardest. What tends to happen, as you know, when governments are attacked from external forces, people rally around the government in defence, and the regime seemed pretty solid after those attacks. There were, obviously grumblings, and there have been and continue to be, but no real serious political opposition in the sense of being well organised. And that's why we've got the son of the former Shah as the only, um, opposition leader anyone can really name, even though he hasn't really been in the country for 40 years. As an alternative to being dropped in to run the country with very little domestic support. And Iran has a very young population, and most of whom have never lived under anything other than an Islamic regime. So I don't think the Shah's capacity to gather support domestically for political reasons is going to play out. So it's a combination of a lot of those things, but also I think there's a realization that the progress that was made under the Obama administration between the two countries has gone well backwards under Trump. And they blame the Israelis for that, perhaps with some good reason. And so what we then saw, of course, is Israeli and American intelligence services working on the grounds to turn the protests, which had been quite peaceful, into quite violent attacks on government officials. And then the Iranians turned off the internet, and that sort of foiled the opportunity for regime change or any significant, well-organized rebellion prompted by external forces. And they weren't able to organize themselves. And I think the Iranians rolled up a lot of those networks as well. So it's a combination of endogenous factors, standard of living, etc., civil liberties, but also using exogenous factors like the involvement of enemy states into trying to use sort of piggyback on those protests to bring the regime down. Now, the one big problem with that, no matter how you look at it, whether you support the insurrections or you oppose them, is what would come next. So if they were successful in overthrowing the Shah's regime, the Mullah's regime, in the absence of any plausible domestic opposition alternative, what would follow? What would you end up with? It could be worse. Although Iran is regularly blamed for supporting Hezbollah and Hamas and the Syrians. It has been, who knows what would come in their place, particularly when opposition's been decimated inside the country, and the people outside the country have a very low profile inside it. And we saw this when the Pentagon tried to parachute Ahmed Chalabi into Iraq after overthrowing the Saddam's regime in 2003. No one had ever heard of him. He had a sort of 1% recognition rate or something, and ended up being completely irrelevant to the future, to the post-Saddam Iraq. The same sort of.
And the West seemed to be the people that knew the most about him in that instance as well. And I wonder if the same is for the want-to-be Shah.
Well, it's interesting. Trump made a comment saying he didn't think he was the right guy. But, the United States is a very complex combination of factors. It's not one person. So Chalabi, for example, was opposed by the State Department, but he was the Pentagon's man. And the Pentagon, with a much larger budget and a much larger influence in the attack on Iraq in 2003, thought that they would get their guy up. The problem was that the population of the country had other views. And this is something that they tend to keep making, a mistake they keep making again and again. It's all very well to decapitate a leadership, but if you haven't got anyone there to take the place, what do? Well, Venezuela is an interesting precedent here. They just got Maduro and his wife, kidnapped them, and left the regime in place, and struck some deals with the vice president, who's now acting president. So that to me is a much more likely scenario for avoiding that sort of difficult task of being seen as an invading and occupying force. The problem with Iran, of course, is there isn't anyone in Iran who's likely to capitulate to that sort of deal in the same way that the Venezuelan government has.
Yeah, very interesting that you mentioned Venezuela there. And I'm wondering if that really fast rendition / decapitation strike is going to be Trump's, new ace up his sleeve that he tries to use to destabilize regimes he doesn't like. But about Pahlavi as well, he seems to be popular with the Israelis, but not so popular with Washington. And that conflict, just like Chalabi, is sort of rearing its head as well. I mean, there are reports that he's not even popular amongst Iranian diaspora in the United States. He's barely popular in that community. He's known as a bit of a playboy. He spends a lot of money, has dwindled a lot of his family's millions or billions that they initially had when they fled Iran. I wanted to speak to you just a little bit more about the protests themselves, because Iranian state media did mention that foreign interference was heavily involved.
This is a well-known playbook. We're watching a regime change operation underway. The goal is to oust another government. This is absolutely war of a particular kind that the CIA and Mossad have used repeatedly over many decades. So the playbook is well known.
They went from peaceful protests to violent protests. There were firearms that were captured, bombs, and they have captured a lot of people accused of being foreign agents. We saw some of this activity happening in and around the wake of the 12-day war, where there seemed to be a lot of assets from Israel that were in the country doing industrial sabotage, planting car bombs, assassinating scientists, all sorts of random chaos that was ensuing. Are these completely linked, these protests, to these cells? And I also wanted to speak to Scott Ritter, who recently said that there was a hardwired intelligence asset in Iran, which had a lot of assets and a lot of connections. And essentially, Trump's pulled the trigger on that with these protests and exposed this network within Iran completely.
This was something that was cooked up in Mar-a-Lago. I mean, Lindsey Graham has admitted it. This is something that Netanyahu and Trump cooked up when Netanyahu was visiting Mar-a-Lago. This was all planned. There was extensive planning going on between the Mossad, the CIA, British intelligence, Dutch intelligence, and every intelligence agency in the world that has been lined up against the Iranians. And yet the United States didn't pull the trigger until it was too late.
Well, I'm not sure if Trump exposed it as such as they were exposed themselves by shutting down their communications section. So Ritter's argument is they couldn't go ahead with the protests and couldn't keep the sabotage up because they couldn't easily communicate with each other without the Iranians finding out who they were, which is apparently what has happened in several cases. So it's a communications issue. But yes, the Israelis have had spies in Iran for decades, as you said, particularly targeting nuclear scientists, academics and nuclear scientists, as well as members of the Revolutionary Guards. We saw Trump kill the head, Soleimani, the head of the IRCG, as well. So you've got lots of foreign assets there, but that's a different thing from being able to say, well, we've got majority of 92 or 3 million people on board as well. You might be able to affect some sort of change, but if you're just dropping like a guy like Pahlavi in, who you can't say you're manufacturing a democratic transition in the country. I mean, none of those people have any democratic credentials whatsoever. I mean, they've never been voted in by anyone. They just appointed them. They were usually former military officers who appointed themselves, and that's all that happened. This is just the way it is. It's a much more complicated issue it's easy, like it's dropping bombs from high altitude, from the safety of high altitude when you haven't got to face sophisticated anti-missile defenses is a relatively easy thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily change anything much on the ground other than cause a lot of destruction. If you want political change and a political transformation, that requires years of building up alternative leaders who will do the job, play the role, and have cultivated domestic support. There's just no one of that kind there. And the fact that they're even talking about a guy who's been living in New York for most of his life, living it up as you said, a playboy, tells you just how poor they have been since 1979, since the revolution, in cultivating alternative, secular leaders who could appeal to the masses and say, well, vote for me and I'll get sanctions removed. We'll do a deal with the Americans and the Israelis, and life will improve. They haven't. We're talking 1979, so I'm trying to remember how many presidents that might be, but it's a lot, and they haven't achieved anything.
And also the US has had this regime change mantra that comes along with their regime change. Is like, we want to put democracy into this country. We want to overthrow this horrible regime and replace it with this, light of democracy. But now with, essentially their handpicked guy is a Shah, is a king that they want to place into this spot. What does this say about Trump's view on American outreach and what these regime changes actually mean to the White House these days? Is this a new kind of model that we might be seeing now, where they just look to install outright dictators or monarchs, as opposed to faux democratic leaders?
Well, I'll say two things. First of all, it's not new. This has been going on since the Second World War.
I'm talking about post end of history here.
Oh,
that there has been a bit of at least pretending that they're trying to put some democratic values into the country.
Yeah, but you have to think about who were the groups most opposed to Trump's initial indication that he was going to bomb Iran a weekend ago. Which regimes? Okay, it was the Sunni regimes who were traditional enemies of Iran, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. They're the ones that said, don't do it. We have no idea what chaos this could cause. We don't know who would take power. There's been a significant improvement in Saudi-Iranian relations in the last 5 years. Really significant improvement. Exchanges of high officials meeting with each other. They don't want to jeopardize that by having the country destabilized by the Americans and the Israelis. So it was Trump's authoritarian dictatorship friends in the Persian Gulf who ultimately prevailed last week The question is, can they prevail as he builds up forces to try and intimidate the Iranians into making some concessions of an unspecified nature? But at the moment, he's basically trading off the Israelis and the Persian Gulf Arab states. Who is going to be more valuable to him in the long run? And he knows with this crazy redevelopment of Gaza and all these other issues, he's going to need a lot of Arab money poured in from the monarchies in the around the Gulf area. So he can't just ignore what they say, and which is why you've seen this incredible anti-Qatar spike in public opinion amongst Republicans, in particular in the United States, blaming Qatar for everything.
They're trying to replace Israel with Qatar.
Well, it's almost you'd think they were trying to, but it's fascinating that the people who are attacking Qatar at the moment don't seem to understand that it was Netanyahu who used Qatar to channel millions and millions of dollars to Hamas.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how it got there. So they aren't even on the same page as the Israelis when it comes to Qatar. So I think we've got more complex dynamics going on, and Trump, if you can give him any credit, at least he's aware that these countries are really concerned about a destabilized Iran in their back neighborhood, and they don't want necessarily to have to reconfigure new relationships with Iran based on who knows who would come to power, or just bombing the country when particularly Iran has said it will target US bases in the region. Not
right.
Obviously, it can't target US forces in situ, but it can, in terms of the US, but it can target US bases in these countries. That's the last thing they want, is to have their countries attacked because they've played host to US bases.
And the classic Iranian threat that's been there for the last 40 years is like, we're going to make hell and we're going to destroy every single bit of oil infrastructure in the region as well and shut down the straits. I mean, that's the big issue that's motivating the Gulf states as well, right?
Oh yeah, I mean the price of oil would just shoot through the roof, which is why presumably why they went after Venezuela first, to try and get the the deals done there. But Venezuela's oil production facilities require billions and billions of dollars of investment to get them up to world standard in terms of extracting the resource. So in the quantities that the US wants it.
It was interesting. I just listened to Adam Tooze and his recent podcast where he went through the Venezuela situation and just pointed out the fact that the oil itself is so viscous and thick, and that really the business case for Chevron and these kind of really efficient companies essentially is just not there. So the argument that there is a corporation-led regime change or opportunity seen in some of these regions, it isn't there anymore. They have good crude coming out of their shale industry in the United States, and essentially attacking Venezuela for the oil wasn't really the excuse that Trump might think it is. And now let's look at the excuse for Iran here, because you and I have gone back and forth on this Iran situation a bit over the last 6 months or so at least. And things have evolved a fair bit. It seems like now there are some military assets that are being, deployed to the region. JD Vance spoke about it quite blasé yesterday, where he kind of went, "Oh, we just want to have options in the region in case something goes wrong." But we're talking about the Lincoln Carrier Group. We're talking about F-15s being stockpiled in some of these airfields around the region. What do you make of the military buildup? How important is it? And also, what could it mean as far as potential actions in the not too distant future?
Well, the question is, what is their objective here? They can't. You're not going to bomb your way to regime change. There's enough hardheads in the Pentagon who know from lots of experience that just won't work. So whether it's symbolic to try and engender changed domestically by external threats, although the Iranians have not been particularly amenable to that in the past, or not is another thing. But remember, the Iranians can absorb a lot of punishment. Can the American media cover up any retaliatory sinkings of US ships in the Persian Gulf from the nightly news? I mean, that sort of thing is not the kind of headline that Trump wants to wake up for. And he doesn't want to see that on his TV feeds. So a lot of it is bluff to see whether it has any effect. But the other thing about the regime change is they've really given Khamenei advanced warning of it. So you can imagine that he's not going to be an easy figure to grab unless they've got really, very incredibly important assets at the very top of the Iranian government and the security services. But the whole integration of the political, security, and military and intelligence and Revolutionary Guard services in Iran means that taking out an individual here or an individual there doesn't change anything very much. Just the next guy comes up to the top. So they haven't done their homework on the political side. They haven't got anyone that's an obvious popular candidate who either the Iranians have taken care of over the years or they themselves have been able to promote as being independent of them. So it's difficult to see what they could achieve by that. They can destroy large chunks of the Iranian ICBM launch systems, which is what the Israelis want them to do. They want them to basically take out those launch facilities where we saw those devastating hypersonic missiles hit Tel Aviv and other places in Israel during the 12-day war in last June. So that's what the Israelis want, but you can never get them all. And the Iranians have had now, 7 months or so to restock, to figure out what worked and what didn't work during the 12 days of the war and where Israel's vulnerabilities are. And according to some reports, the Israelis still haven't restocked their anti-ballistic missile storage weapons yet. They're still waiting on. They take a long time to build, and they have to get them from the US. So the Israelis weren't ready for that kind of another 12-day war yet either. But what's the objective? And if you don't just start a conflict and see what happens. You've got to have a clear objective and a reasonable chance of getting to where your objective is. And I just don't know what that is. And the Americans haven't articulated it either.
Well, Scott, I mean, the difference could be, I mean, we saw after the Damascus embassy bombing there was a salvo that was launched from Iran. And essentially that was communicated through to Washington and to Israel. And they kind of played space invaders there somewhere over Iraq and Jordan and shot most of the drones and the missiles out of the sky. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what that American presence could mean. I mean, they are the strongest preeminent military power in the world. And, the shock and awe that sort of should be giving negative connotations towards the Pentagon and Washington is something that they may be thinking about doing here, hitting Tehran with these decapitation strikes with bunker busters and the whole fireworks kind of thing. Does the US have the capacity, if it's determined, to, essentially do what it wants to do in Iran, regime change?
I think it would have the opposite effect, more likely to have the opposite effect. You start bombing densely populated city centres, you're going to engender civilian casualties. That's not the way to win people over to your side. It's all very well for people outside the country, like the Nobel Prize winner in Venezuela saying bomb Venezuela, or Pahlavi saying bomb it. But when you're living there and you can't, and you're being attacked and obliterated and your missile defenses are of limited value, that's not the way to win over a regime change. The question is whether what the lines of communication are between Tehran and Washington. Prior in the 12-day war, they gave them basically notice that the war was about to happen. Trump pretty much told them, this is what's going to happen, this is what the Israelis are going to do, this is what we're going to do, and this is when we're going to do it. That was a backdoor diplomacy connection that was established by John Kerry when he was negotiating the JCPOA. So the Iranians have a way of talking with the Americans and vice versa when they need to. The question is whether those lines of communication are still open, or whether the collapse of trust between the countries as a result of the conflict has severed them completely. And I'm just not in the position to know what the answer to that is. But we would all hope that those lines of communication do exist, either through a third party, perhaps through the Russians, or someone else who could keep those. So there's greater transparency about what's actually happening here. And remember, Trump's playing different games at the same time. He's got tremendous pressure from Israel and the Israel lobby in the United States to finish off the regime or to destroy it. He's also got problems, but he's got the countervailing pressures coming from the Gulf states as well. So managing all that into a coherent policy would be difficult for the most astute strategic planner, and I'm not sure he fits into that category.
If you like what you're seeing and you're enjoying seeing Bogan Intel back for 2026, please like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, or leave a rating on wherever you listen to us on your podcasts. This goes a long way to promoting our program to a wider audience. And if you feel like becoming more than just someone who clicks a button, please head to www.boganintel.com and sign up for free articles and episodes of this podcast. Or if you're feeling adventurous, sign up for only $5 a month and help a Bogan out to bring you some more of this content in a sea of content that isn't like this content. Back to the program. What comes next seems to be something that baffles many people, including the Pentagon and the White House at the moment. As you say, what is the end game here? What are they going to achieve from this action? It looks at the moment that they've got assets that are targets for hypersonic missiles sitting in the region. And do the Americans want to be in that position? And you mentioned once again that huge pressure from Israel. And I think this is the big point here. I mean, the whole Iranian adventure is really dependent on Israel's influence over the White House and whether it can twist some arms in the Americas to get them to overcommit to something. How much is this battle defining what will or won't happen in Iran right now? And, you were mentioning this in previous times we've chatted, that really, there are elements within the Beltway in Washington that are quite adamant that they don't want to have this war with Iran, that it will be, an empire-ending move, essentially, for America. So, do you still feel that those forces are diametrically opposed, fighting each other in the background? Or is one of them starting to win a little bit more? We know that when Trump commits military assets to a region, that he doesn't mind doing something with them, as we saw with Venezuela. So, yeah, I mean, has the arm been twisted?
Well, remember, the context for this, of course, is 1953, when the last time they overthrew a government in Iran. That ushered in the repression of the Shah's years, which gave way to the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So it didn't turn out so well. The question, I guess, is whether I don't think Trump seriously believes he's going to run for a third term. If he was, and he needed financial backing for it, then I would say, okay, he's more vulnerable to financial interests from those who donated to him this time, in terms of people like the Sheldons and others who funneled him lots of money to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to basically put Israel first. But as you say, the countervailing powers was inside the Beltway. The idea that the United States would be administering a country of 92 million hostile Iranians is bizarre, and make Iraq look like a picnic. It's just not going to happen. And it's not realistic. So he's caught in that, dilemma of pleasing his donor base, those around him who tell him how wonderful he is and how much money they'll give him if he does what they tell him. But the practical reality of accomplishing what they want is trying to bring a fantasy to reality, and it's just not going to happen. It just doesn't happen that way. It's not the way international politics has ever worked. And even when you think you've achieved something like they did in '53 to get rid of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was nationalizing the oil industry, and put the Shah, who was just a military officer, in place. Look what that did. The repression of the Shah's years, led to a disastrous outcome for the United States and Israel when the Iranian Revolution took over in 1979. So I just can't see why, again, the end game is not clear. Ideally, Trump is, I think, risk averse. He doesn't like the idea of being saddled with dead American bodies. He doesn't like bad news footage or news coverage of failed military operations or where you suffer significant losses along the way. So the Israelis are saying, we've got to go all the way. There's no point in pussyfooting around here. If we're going to do it, we're going to do it properly. And Trump's thinking, I know enough about, at least I know enough about wars to know these things never go as planned. They always go awry. Things happen that you don't expect. So if I had to put a bet on it, I'd say sort of stasis is the most likely outcome, with the Americans showing force in the Persian Gulf without any serious mainstream attack, other than perhaps a sort of some occasional pinpoint reinforcement of what they did last June or in the weeks after that, where they took out some what they said were key repositories of fissile material, which I think had been moved anyway, mostly, but certainly set the Iranian nuclear program back. But what does that do? It only encourages, as John Mearsheimer, the realist said, it only encourages the Iranians to rush to build a nuclear weapon. As the North Korean example is shining brightly in the eyes of the Ayatollah, you can bet. What makes us different to North Korea? North Korea has nuclear weapons. They won't attack them. So our mistake was to be hoodwinked and tricked into a nuclear limitation agreement with the Americans when Obama was in power. So I won't make that mistake twice.
Well, that joint comprehensive plan of action almost put everyone to sleep a little bit, but it also gave the Iranians a bit of like diplomatic ingenuity and clout that may be running into those back channels that you're speaking about. And one could say that potentially the Iranians have quite a sophisticated line of communication in the background with Washington that's developed over the years. We have seen it sort of rear its head a little bit around these conflicts, as you say. Some of it's been telegraphed, some of the potential attacks and things like that on Iran itself and Persia. Essentially a 5,000-year-old civilization state that has, in one way or another, been intact the whole way through. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, there's a bit of a folly when the US looks at its regime changes in the region. It might apply the logic that it looked at the Sykes-Picot countries there in Syria and Iraq, and may see that Iran's just another version of that. But there are some really big differences regarding, say, Iraq and Iran. The topography, for example, when you look at invading armies like Alexander the Great or, anyone that's sort of gone off into a Persian campaign, there is this one thing that sticks out, and that's the topography, the mountainous terrain, the difficulty it is for armies to move around, the ability for the local forces to be able to use that, geography to their advantage. And then we've also got, say, the Iraq-Iran war, where we got to demonstrate Iran's, last full-scale involvement in a massive war in the region. And what really stands out there is how committed Iranians are to the battle once they're in it. So I want to ask how those factors might influence a potential conflict and what the strikes may actually look like. I mean, we're hearing that within days to weeks there may be some kind of action. So what do those strikes look like, and how do they contrast against the topography and the actual people of Iran themselves that are maybe getting involved in a big exchange?
Well, it depends on where those sites are. Some of them obviously are isolated, so there are no large-scale civilians at risk if they were to be attacked. I suspect they'll be, if the attacks do come, they would be military only, because anything else will just aggravate the population further. And you have to remember, you're right about the topography. Some of the, it's like the Israelis saying Hamas used to hide their intelligence and headquarters in hospitals and schools. Well, the Israelis did exactly the same thing in Tel Aviv, in densely populated Tel Aviv, with their intelligence and military intelligence headquarters. Well, the Iranians, I presumably, do the same thing. Everyone does pretty much the same thing. But you also got to remember, it's not just the topography. Iraq, which is an important country, neighboring Iran with a long history of conflict, is now is about 60% Shia. You not in attacking Iran, you not only just have to worry about what the Iranians will do, but you have to worry about what Iran's supporters, friends, co-religionists, and neighbors are going to do. And the Americans will be expecting to use Iraqi airspace in order to attack Iran, I suspect. It may not be as easy as they would hope, particularly given the population, the demographic balance and religious balance of the country. So, yeah, look, I'd imagine they have no idea how they would control the country or run it, and nor could they snuff out every pocket of resistance to an attack without just basically destroying the entire country. And that would not be in America's interests in any way, shape, or form. So I think what we'll see is targeted military strikes, and the Iranians will retaliate against ships, American ships in the Gulf, as well as American bases in Gulf states, where the Americans may have limited capacity to defend, or much less capacity to defend those particular bases. So if the Iranians look like they're scoring even, 1 in every 6 attacks, or 1 in 8, that's a bad. It may look, it's a terrible fraction for the Iranians, but it's one that the Americans may not have tolerance for either. So again, you can't do these things without anticipating the unintended consequences of your actions. And the word unintended is the key here. You may not want it, but you don't exactly know what will happen. You don't exactly know what the reaction will be and where it will be.
Well, and the other thing too is, I mean, the US hasn't been engaged against an opponent that has had these modern technologies, like the drones, the hypersonics, the modern cruise missile technology. The US hasn't come up against this kind of this threat before. And
Well, also the key thing here is that the Iranians have not yet considered any of the attacks existential.
no,
If the regime regards its very existence as being a threat, all bets are off, all restraints are off. And we saw, I think Russians were flying in anti-ballistic missile systems last week to top them up. So what we've seen up until now, and particularly during that 12-day conflict with Israel, was a limited exchange, just to give a sample of what could happen. They weren't at the tipping point of thinking the regime was about to tip over. If they think this is a massive attempt at regime change, what would be the constraint on the Iranian leadership in terms of what weapon systems they wouldn't use or where they wouldn't use them? They've got nothing left to lose if their
gloves are off.
very existence is in jeopardy.
Yeah, and with that gloves are off moment, we could see, we saw a little slice of what Iran could do in Tel Aviv in that exchange last year. And they couldn't stop some of those missiles going through, most of which were actually the older stock. We didn't see some of the more advanced hypersonic missiles that are in the arsenal being used, and Iran's been keeping them as an ace up their sleeve. And on that, John Mearsheimer has, kind of warned that an Iranian counterattack could involve, missiles and drones targeting Israel, but also those US bases you mentioned, but also closing down the Straits of Hormuz, which is, 20 to 30% of the global oil supply.
What will the regime, which remains in place, do as a consequence? And number one, as I just explained, the regime will pound Israel, and the Israelis don't want that. Secondly, the regime will go after American military bases and American troops in the region, and we really don't want that. And the third thing is that the regime in Tehran is likely to shut down the Straits of Hormuz and therefore shut down the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf, which would have devastating effects on the international economy. So the point is that as long as the regime in Tehran is in power, it doesn't make sense to hit them with American military power or Israeli military power, because the regime in Tehran has retaliatory options.
Do you agree with this, with Mearsheimer's assessment there, with your knowledge of Iran's capabilities? You've also mentioned those war games where, the US loses in the region. So how does a trade-off between US and Israel and Iran play out with a full escalation? And how could the US be pushing for that outcome, considering the war games, considering the truth and the facts about what that could actually mean?
Well, remember, they have to sell this idea to the American people. And when I say sell it, I mean sell the idea that they're going to be American casualties and that we should absorb those for a greater good. Now, given nothing fundamental has changed in terms of Iran's outreach to the world, other than its diminished influence since the attacks on Gaza and the destruction of its allies in the region, what would be the trigger for a full-scale war against Iran led by the United States? What would suddenly have come into existence which would justify that now? And it's all very well for armchair, pundits like us to speculate about missiles going here, there, and everywhere, but the tangible effects of this would restrict airspace to every civilian airliner in the world around that part of the world. Will have ongoing knock-on effects of tourism in the Middle East again. Israel's already seen its tourism industry collapse as a result of what's been going on in Gaza. It's the unintended consequences that you have to worry about. Some of the things you can think your way through and plan for, but you can never think of everything that might happen. What happens to the Jordanians? Where do they go? Are they going to allow airspace to be used by the Americans to attack Iran as they did in June, therefore being seen by the Iranians as collaborating in the attack on their country? There's all sorts of, that's just one of 1,000 subsidiary issues that have to be worked through. And frankly, I don't think the Trump administration has the strategic nous or I guess you'd say sophistication to work through all of those things when the timing seems to be done by a decision of the president, surrounded by a whole lot of dubious characters who say, let's do something now to take attention away from Epstein, or let's do it now to relieve pressure coming from the Israelis and their friends in Washington. That's the last thing you want to do or allow to be determining your time frame for these sorts of things. And again, the only way a regime change will take place in Iran is when there is a sufficient domestic political opposition to the existing regime, which has the means to take power. And neither of those things seem to be obvious, despite what all the cheerleaders and living outside the country say about how much the Iranian people hate the regime. They may well. There's aspects of it of course they would hate. But you can't just say, well, I hate that, I'll get rid of these guys, and who's going to take the place? What will the political complexion of the country looked like and the religious complexion after most of the people who've lived there know nothing other than what that currently exists there in the country. They've got no answers to these questions.
They probably need more of a Mossadegh character than a Shah character. And to get a Mossadegh character, you need rapprochement. You need to drop the sword, and you need to allow Iran to interface with the world around it organically. And for these movements to have a little bit of a mooring to the actual people of Iran, as opposed to something that's airlifted in from New York and plonked in the middle of Tehran.
So that's the thing you've got. It's carrots and sticks. Carrots are much more effective.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone likes to talk about the sticks, and no one talks about carrots. But the one thing you do want to do is give the Iranian regime an incentive to liberalize, even though there's limitations on that happening to the extent that we would ever be satisfied with. But you need the Iranians you need to give the Iranians reasons to change their. If you don't like the way they are and the way they behave, give them reasons to change, not threats. Just having a relationship based on threats all the time. And that was the great tragedy of the JCPOA, is that the Iranians negotiated directly with the Americans for an agreement, and who knows where that could have expanded to, in what other areas, in cognate fields and things, where you could say, okay, we were able to reach an agreement on nuclear factors. Let's now talk about economic liberalization, integration, markets, etc. That sort of thing. And before you know it, Iran is globalized. It becomes a globalized country. That's what if you're talking in terms of liberal economics, that's what you should be aiming for, because you don't want people putting up the shutters and pulling up the borders. You want them to integrate into the global world economy, because then everyone has a stake in your future. Not just you, but everyone wants to trade. If people want to trade, they want to be tourists, they want to invest there because there are opportunities, then all of the incentive to just keep pulverizing the country or keep it as a isolated one where, you're just subjected to threats on a regular basis all the time and periodic attacks. Well, that's not going to happen. Why would the Iranians be interested in that? There's no incentive for them to go that route, and that's the historical tragedy of modern Iran is not just the regime that emerged there, but the fact that they know the outsiders who are concerned about that regime have virtually never given it an opportunity to change course through incentives.
And they have
raising the standard of living of their citizens, giving them opportunities to travel, and investing in local businesses, and developing the country as a normal state capitalist economy, that sort of thing. They just don't do it.
Well, throughout the 90s particularly, and up until 9/11, there was a liberalization happening in Iran with the regime and an outreach happening. I mean, wasn't it quite well known that Iran offered its border to essentially help add its Taladex to the Northern Alliance with Afghanistan early? Was one of the first countries to get back and offer their support to the United States around some operations in Afghanistan. They were knocked back, and then the axis of evil kicked in with George W. Bush, and we're in a whole new era.
I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
But it seems like when given half a chance, the regime in Iran's always looking for some kind of equalization to drop its guard a little bit and interact with the region around it. But it keeps getting donked on the head, right? So, I mean, that's the problem.
The Iranians were one of the very few countries, perhaps the only one, who volunteered to liberate Kosovo from Serbian atrocities there. And the Americans said, no way we're allowing you guys in there. Because to help out your co-religionists in there, and they were prepared to do that. They're happy to do it. But within Iran, it's very easy just to write it off as a sort of a dictatorship of one particular group. But there are within that group, there are significant divisions of, there are people you could call reformers. There are people who are reactionaries. They hardly speak to each other. They don't like each other at all. There are differences between them. And I would have thought the West should be cultivating the reformist within the Iranian ruling elite, rather than trying to lump them all in under one supreme leader and demonizing them perpetually, demonizing them as irredeemable, no point in engaging with them, they're fanatics, that sort of thing. In the end, you're just basically saying you're not giving yourself any opportunity to do anything. And this is where we've come to, with a country that has had a revolution there now since before the 1980s, and with no leverage, almost no leverage over any groups or with any significant political players within the country. And what a total failure of Western diplomacy that is. I mean,
Totally.
you barely find a worse example of how poorly it's been handled. I mean, I'm not diminishing Iran's responsibility either, but to be honest with you, that's just been a catastrophic failure of Western diplomacy. Just a country of that significance and that importance refusing to engage with them and not talk to them. I mean, it's just embarrassingly stupid and naive, and that's why we're in the situation we're in today.
Including billions of dollars of cash on pallets and, all sorts of deals cut between multiple administrations. And you're right, it is such a ginormous failure for such an important nation of 91 million people that are the regional power. And there could have been a couple of ways to skin this cat, you reckon, where there would be a much better situation right now going on in Iran, and they could arguably have been a partner of choice. There's just been a thorn in the side of that happening the whole way through, and that has been in Tel Aviv, who sees Iran as a zero-sum game, that it must be eliminated, that it must be pacified, with its intentions to become a regional hegemon. So we're once again seeing Israel's foreign policy trump America's national interest, and that tussle is being seen on the world stage again with Donald Trump. But I did want to ask you a little bit about middle powers like Australia and how we're involved in this session of manufacturing consent for another war that's going on right now. Australia has been quite stern on Iran, particularly under the Albanese government. Penny Wong's been very quick to criticize Iran whenever possible, so much so that we've done one of the most drastic and draconian acts of diplomacy with Iran, where we've suspended their diplomats. We no longer have a line to Tehran, and this is in contrast to many countries in Europe that still do, and many countries around the world that still do. We lead the OECD with one of the most strictest kind of punishments against Iran for those attacks in Australia, which we still haven't really got enough information on whether they did it or not. But I want to ask you a little bit about how middle powers shape manufacturing consent. And in your previous appearance on the podcast, you mentioned something about Australia potentially not being in this war, but there won't be a chance of Australia becoming a part of this war due to public interests and uproar that will happen if we're involved. But now things are changing, and we're seeing on the ABC, we're seeing in the bipartisan political class, this zero-sum game starting to sort of creep into the conversations here. So I'm asking you, do you think that this may be changing a little bit? We do have a presence in the Red Sea at the moment, and we're quite keen to be involved or be seen to be involved in in America's operations. So what do you think?
Well, you can never underestimate the stupidity of the Australian political elite.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, when the Liberals were last in, they had Julie Bishop going to Iran on several times, and as foreign minister, and we were seen as a indirect conduit between the Americans and the Iranians. So if the Americans couldn't front up in person because of the long-standing hostility, they could use a country like Australia as a middle power to transmit messages and test the waters, if you like, of Iranian thinking and report back. Now they've, as you said, they have kicked out the ambassador, and this is over the alleged ties to the firebombing at the Adas Hebrew Center in Caulfield. Now it may be that as you said, it's still very murky as to how directly involved they were. It appears that they may have employed people to do the firebombing for them rather than do it themselves. But ASIO's intelligence is under question on a number of fronts at the moment, including what happened at Bondi. So we need to have more detail before we can say things definitively. But I think there's very little to be gained by joining any American and Israeli attack on Iran, which would be opposed by a significant number of European countries. And Canada, perhaps. And it's interesting that, the Board of Peace that Mr. Trump has been organizing to administer Gaza has now, I think the Spanish and the Norwegians, the Germans have pulled out. They're not going to accept the invitation. I think the British have not made a decision. The Canadians had their invitation withdrawn, and Australia has said we're too busy to make a decision, or it's too hard. So, and at
the moment, the countries that have signed up look like a cast of villains from 40 years of Hollywood movies, right? You got.
Well, look, we've got two, Netanyahu and Putin. I don't think Putin is committed yet. I think he's thinking about it, but Netanyahu agreed. But he couldn't go to Davos because he'd be arrested and sent to the ICC. And the same would have happened to Putin. So if he had accepted and gone. So Mr. Albanese might be sitting down with two indicted war criminals and have to make a citizen's arrest when he's sitting around the table and take them off to The Hague. If they've got any brains, they just say, look, it's this is not for us at this stage. You've got no Palestinians leading the charge in this group, and you've got the person responsible for the genocide in Gaza on the board. I mean, it makes no sense. It's insane. So why would you want to join that? As to the other point about whether we'd join in some sort of firing expedition in the Persian Gulf, I don't think we've either got the technology or the political inclination to do that. I mean, all you'd be doing would be enjoying the future enmity of Iran and other states who thought the whole idea of it is crazy. You have to remember the one thing that we can't remember, a lot of countries don't understand, but the Iranians do. Their government was overthrown in 1953. It was overthrown by the CIA and MI6. We may not take this seriously because, but they do. They know that foreign interference in their country is not new. Right? It's happened before. Got rid of a government that was dispersing the oil-rich assets of the country for its population, and it was chucked out, and a monarchy was installed. By the way, Kissinger tried to sell nuclear weapons to Iran during that period, which is also not well known because it was the Shah. So everything if you try and put yourself, as you should as a diplomat and an analyst, try and put yourself in the shoes of the Iranians as much as you can, you must understand that they are the country which has seen their government and the whole political system transformed by outsiders, not by their choice, by outsiders. And that the 79 revolution, whatever you think about it, was endogenous, right? It came from within the country and enjoyed initially at least some, enough support to grab hold and stay in power ever since. So that's the context in which you have to understand how they view future attacks from Israel, the United States, or any other country which is stupid enough to try and achieve some change of regime there.
And that's the thing. The Shah was torturing students, Islamists and socialists alike, for decades there. And there has been many actions, both covert and overt, to destroy this regime from outside. No wonder there are slogans like "death to so and so," because there has been this history of their back to the wall, and we did get to see that in the wake of the 12-day war. A country that has always had a resistance and an opposition to the regime that's native and inherent to it. You saw feminists, you saw, liberals within that country rally behind the regime in the wake of those attacks. It was a bit of a touch one, touch all situation, as a lot of people, maybe from dissident groups within Iran, are realizing that they're on the menu too here. And a lot of the women and minorities that the Israelis, for example, are crying for so much at the moment, and they seem like maybe crocodile tears, those people are going to be targets of bombs at some stage to liberate. The women that are going to be liberated, they're going to be hit with bombs first before they're liberated. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of people within Iran that sort of understand this, despite the fact that there were some people protesting, and there were a bunch of people that have been executed for protesting as well, right?
Yeah, look, yes, of course. And also, you shouldn't underestimate the extent to which there is goodwill towards Iran outside the country's borders. I mean, it was only the Houthis and the Iranians who were supporting Hezbollah, Hamas, the regime in Syria. So the Iranians have built up,
and the Palestinian movement.
Yeah, the Palestinian. Well, there wouldn't be no Palestinian movement in Gaza of any significance without Iranian support. That's the quid pro quo of blaming the Iranians for Hamas, is that when no one else was there to help them, the Iranians were. Well, the Houthis suffered casualties to support them as well. So it's not just Iran when you're talking, and then you've got Iraq and the Shia population of Iraq who would be very concerned by a widespread attack on Iran. I'm sure if you look at the speeches of Ayatollah Sistani, the Shia cleric in southern Iraq, he's very close to the Iranians, and he would, a command from him to support the Iranians in their time of peril would not be unanswered. And
we saw what happened with Muqtada al-Sadr and the Mahdi, the Shia fighting groups there in southern Iraq. We don't want them rearing their head again. They were a nightmare for the West.
Well, this is it. And then there are other threats. I mean, if you're concerned about Bondi, perhaps you should be focusing on ISIS and the recrudescence of ISIS, and who were the people responsible for keeping it alive, and who used it in Syria for their own political objectives. Perhaps,
and who healed their wounded in military hospitals in Jordan, for example.
Exactly. So perhaps the focus should be there rather than Iran. But I guess the great unknown factor, of course, is Trump's thinking here, because he can impose tariffs one day, or threaten to impose tariffs one day on countries which trade with Iran, or and then take them off the next day, or when someone told him China is a trading partner of Iran. These sort of things are really quite crazy in terms of predictability. It's just very unsettling to know who has his ear, whether he's got his own views about this, and the extent to which he mistrusts the deep state, which he did in the first term, as being out to get him rather than offer him good advice. But ultimately, none of that can be achieved without the Pentagon getting on board. And whilst Venezuela is a relatively small example of what they can do, and Cuba may be also in that category, Iran's in a very different category, because who is going to stay behind and administer the country? Who's going to seal its borders? Who is going to ensure that a more radical fringe of Shia, Islamic Shia militancy doesn't emerge to take control of the country? After all, an American invasion or an attack will just play into the hands of those who said the great Satan is the great Satan. It will confirm all of the claims made by the reactionaries within the regime, not the reformists. So every time the Americans or the Israelis attack Iran, it's the reformists in the Israeli political elite who get kicked in the teeth because they get told by the reactionaries, we told you, can't trust them, don't deal with them, don't talk with them. They'll only come back and ask for more, and then when they don't get more, they'll kick your teeth in. So
the butterfly effect of that throughout the region too, as we've mentioned before, the Saudis, who are increasingly starting to get a little bit worried about the situation here. And they're saying that potentially Israel could want the same thing for them eventually down the track. I think those developments around the UAE there and kicking them out of Yemen and things like that are something that's bubbling under the surface. And as you said, the rapprochement, the Pakistan, Iran, Saudi, that trilateral thing that's happening there in the background was just unprecedented 5 years ago, really, to even see the Saudis and the Iranians, connecting in this kind of way. So, there are some huge developments. And look, I realized I've had you for a long time, and I appreciate you being our first episode for the year. It's very informative, but I wanted to ask you just, one last question from your realist lens and your writings you've done about US blowback and your skepticism of regime change in general. Do you see any silver linings in these developments? Or is this just like another, escalation that benefits hawks in Tel Aviv and Washington?
Look, there's one thing that does, I think, make me feel a little bit optimistic, and that is that even within those what we used to think were pretty shut down, lockdown Gulf monarchies, repressive Gulf monarchies, they are now having to take account of public opinion in their countries. As much as they would want to shaft the Palestinians, and as much as they would want to turn turn Gaza into some sort of Miami or whatever and pour money in and make money out of it, they know that their hands are being tied by their own populations who know what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians in Gaza and on the West Bank. So even within what we would call normally dictatorships, family dictatorships, or as they often family-owned petrol stations, as they're often referred to, these are now having to be responsive to domestic political pressure. Even the Saudis, the UAE, they can't just go ahead and dismiss the concerns of their populations as they used to freely do. And that's a positive development. It means that the reason some of these countries have not joined the Abraham Accords is not because the political elite didn't want to. It's because in the circumstances that were going on in Gaza over the last 2 years, they would have had riots on their hands domestically if they'd have done that. So that's that's a positive thing. The other positive thing is that is Trump's risk aversion. He's not a guy he's a risk averse guy. He's not a player he wants change, he wants structural change, and he desperately wants to get the credit for it. But he doesn't want to have to do the nasty, dirty work of, welcoming body bags back into the US in order to achieve it. So he may not be able to achieve the kind and get the credit he needs and craves if without the cost that he wants to avoid at all costs. Others are not so squeamish about these things, Biden and perhaps Obama, but Trump, I think, is very keen that his popularity is linked to the idea that he doesn't put American boys at risk unnecessarily. Well, you can't invade Iran or attack Iran on a full scale without putting American lives at risk. And unfortunately for him, that's not something he really wants to embrace.
As you say here, there doesn't seem to be, an ultimate end game. Trump wants something that he can't quite achieve. But what he's deploying to the region favors one side over the other. And it favors the side that Trump doesn't really want to be involved in, which is a protracted, long war with a regional power that has some pretty good capability there. there seems to be a crunch happening here, or they're walking into a big rake by sending in carrier groups to the region. And, there could be a false flag attack. There could be something that brings or draws America, Gulf of Tonkin incident or something like that, or anything that could, sort of force Trump's hand into this war. And I also worry a little bit about other interests, particularly in the region, that may want to force that hand and may be looking to do anything they can to get those forces committed.
He certainly would remember what happened to Mr. Bush after he declared mission accomplished. He doesn't want that on his own, dominating the rest of his second term, which is precisely what happened with George W. Bush. So he doesn't want to. He wants credit. He wants prizes. He wants praise. He's not going to get that if he's embroils the United States into a protracted conflict in Iran with no obvious outcome other than pleasing the Israel lobby and the Israelis for doing the hard work for them. Where does the American taxpayer benefit from that?
Yeah, spot on, Scott. And with the shuddering still happening from the Iraq War, I mean, the bad taste that left in the mouth of the US population is still there. And there was a very developed and elaborate lie that was spun to essentially manufacture that consent, bring in the world and bring in the US population. I don't think that's been done so effectively this time with Iran. And it's going to be very hard to sell this to anyone, including the military class in Washington. Thank you very much for coming on board today, Scott, and appreciate your time as always.
Thanks, Joel. Always good to talk to you.
Cheers, mate.